Tan Sooi Beng is Professor of Ethnomusicology at the School of Arts, University Science Malaysia, or USM in Penang. She is the author of Bangsawan, a social and stylistic history of popular Malay opera, and co-author of Music Malaysia, Classical, Folk, and Syncretic Traditions, as well as Longing for the Past, the 78 RPM era in Southeast Asia, thus to digital in 2013, which won the joint SEM Bruno Nettel Prize in 2014. She edited the book Eclectic Cultures for All, the development of the Peranakan performing, visual, and material arts in Penang. Dr. Tan is the Vice President of the International Council for Traditional Music and serves in the advisory editorial board of Asian Music in the US. She is actively engaged in the practice of community theater for young people and in the promotion of local heritage in Penang. Her lecture is titled Redrawing Boundaries, Sonic Movements, Encounters, and Discords in Colonial Maritime Southeast Asia. Her talk is pre-recorded. However, she is here with us live from Malaysia to answer your questions, which you may type at the Q&A box below. Please welcome Dr. Tan Sooi Beng.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is an honor for me to give the keynote on boundaries today. My sincere thanks to APSE and the local hosts at UP Diliman. The title of my talk today is Redrawing Borders, Sonic Movements, Encounters and Discords in Colonial Maritime Southeast Asia. Following the definitions of Chicana writer Gloria Anzaldua's borderlands, borders or boundaries are demarcations that divide people into separate groups based on particular traits such as race, class, gender, nationality, identity, language, or religion. On the other hand, borderlands are ambiguous spaces where people of different ethnic, spiritual, or ideological backgrounds meet, interact, and negotiate conflicts across the artificial boundaries. As a result of intercultural contact, new types of mixed ethnicities, syncretic cultures, and ways of knowing are formed in these borderland spaces. Research on the people in marginal spaces, such as those living at the boundaries of racial, religious, sexual, or gender norms, can result in alternative ways of understanding their lives. Through a discussion of the Malay opera, or bangsawan, and its music that was recorded by gramophone companies in the first half of the 20th century in British Malaya, this paper shows that the Malay opera was a type of cultural borderland. Cultural borderlands refer to spaces where ethnic groups who live between socio-cultural borders mix and blend their cultures with the mainstream culture. They are also spaces where border crossers struggle with the complexities of identity creation, conflicts, and where they struggle for change against hegemonic powers. This paper illustrates that the notions of geographical and cultural borders in the Malay Archipelago were fluid before the formation of nation-states. It shows the agency of the performers and challenges imperial and state narratives and essentialist representations of identities, modernities, and gender roles of the performing artists of the Malay Archipelago in the early 20th century. Borderland research involves the recovering of mobile soundscapes that have been disremembered and reclaiming new ones that include the voices of the people from below through unconventional sources such as old newspapers, photographs, and gramophone recordings, as well as oral interviews. Unlike earlier studies in ethnomusicology that focus on synchronic folk and court traditions, borderland research highlights recent discourses about inter-Asian transcultural networks that have influenced sonic and cultural histories of the region. In the past 2 centuries, transnational mobility for purposes of trade, entertainment, pilgrimage, migration or labor has been fundamental to the socio-economic, political, and cultural transformations in Asia and many parts of the world. With the invention of the steamship, port cities such as Shanghai, Tokyo, Bombay, Singapore, and Batavia or Jakarta became sites where networks of people in entertainment, including musicians, dancers, actors and actresses, recording engineers, and filmmakers from different parts of the world sojourned and interacted. The convergence of new technologies such as the gramophone, radio and film, and new types of modern theatre and music resulted in the creation of new cultural expressions that were global and yet local. The port cities of Asia, such as those in British Malaya, became multi-ethnic, multilingual, and multi-religious. A wide range of non-indigenous cultural activities and commercial theatre, such as the European and American operetta, revue, and vaudeville, Chinese opera, and Parsi theatre, visited the port cities to provide entertainment for the multi-ethnic population. It was at this time that the hybrid local theatre, bangsawan, and music emerged to entertain the multi-ethnic and multilingual audiences. Adapted from the travelling Parsi theatre from Bombay that toured Asia, bangsawan was performed live by travelling troupes throughout the Malay Archipelago. Bangsawan was commercial theatre that attracted multi-ethnic audiences. It was hybrid theatre that combined European, Malay, Arabic, Chinese stories, dance and music, as well as costumes. Troupes toured the islands of the Malay Archipelago. Bangsawan engendered the first Malay orchestra or Orkes Melayu that combined both European dance band instruments as well as Malay, Indian and Chinese instruments. Malay opera music was disseminated through gramophone records, radio and amusement parks. Bangsawan music circulated in the Asian region, London and Australia. For example, Terang Bulan or Bright Moonlight traversed the different seas and became the national anthem of Malaysia in 1957, entitled Negaraku or My Country. It is said that the Malay nobility who were exiled in the Seychelles by the British brought the tune to Perak when they returned. They used it as the state anthem of Perak. Others say that the tune was adopted from a popular French melody entitled La Rosalie. The song was popular among the people of the Nusantara as it was performed live at Istanbul and bangsawan theatres, dance halls, and film, and it was available on record. We shall now listen to three versions. In 1928, the Keroncong Orkes Eurasia, comprising students from the Dutch East Indies living in the Netherlands, recorded Terang Bulan with Edison Bell in London. The second version is Mamula Moon by Felix Mendelssohn and his Serenaders, and the third version is Moonlight Night of the Southern Sea by Shanghai singer Yao Li in the 1950s.
berani sumpah dia takut mati.
By looking at how the Malay folk song crossed borders geographically and sonically in the Malay Archipelago, London, Sydney, Bombay, Calcutta and Hong Kong, through live performances and the gramophone records of the early 20th century, I move away from the center-periphery paradigm. There was no one-way flow, and there were many centers of production of folk and popular music. The artists crossed borders in their lives and were borderland individuals. They lived and travelled in the trans-border space of the Malay Archipelago. They came from the different islands of the Malay Archipelago and from various ethnic and religious backgrounds. They performed and stayed for months in the different islands. They created social and cultural networks as they crossed the borders of Malaya, Borneo, Java, Sumatra, Bangkok, Shanghai, Bombay, Calcutta, Istanbul, and other cities. They interacted and intermarried with local and foreign performers. Khairuddin Nordin's mother was Chinese. His father was a Malay sailor who travelled from Malaya to Hong Kong. He started Dean's Opera that toured Bangkok, Malaya, Sumatra, Bali, Java, and Sarawak. He married Tija from Pontianak. Laila Sani was born in Ceylon. She followed her parents in the Kansas circus to Istanbul, Tehran, Baghdad, Java, and Singapore before joining Bangsawan. Momo Latif was born in Batavia in 1923. She joined the Dardanella Dramatic Company from the Dutch East Indies and toured Hong Kong, Shanghai, Canton, Bombay, and Calcutta with the troupe. She arrived in Singapore in 1935 and became a bangsawan and film star. Alfonso Soliano was a well-known Filipino musician. His father had been employed to play in a Selangor state band in the early 20th century and stayed on in Malaya after that, performing in bangsawan theatre. Aminah Nani's father was Javanese, her mother was European. She travelled with Dean's Opera to Java and Borneo. She studied with Miss Ribut in Java and married bangsawan performer Alias from Malaya. Borderland studies show the agency of the people in creating their own mixed cultures and identities. Remapping boundaries helps us to be aware of the motivations and strategies of mobile performers in the shared space of the Malay Archipelago in the early 20th century. They relied on existing traditions of the region as they created new ones. Their mixed identities and trans-border experiences helped them to create the syncretic music of the Malay opera. The bangsawan performers created hybrid music that combined Malay folk and new foreign elements. The next example is a recording of Dondan Sayang, or Love Song, by Miss Ruhani that was recorded by Pathe in the 1940s. The singers exchange verses in repartee style. They are accompanied by the violin or viola, rebana frame drum, and gong. Malay opera music was not only localized, but was hybrid, dynamic, and changed according to time and space. The music was current, but emphasized continuity and difference with the past. The fusion of Malay tunes, rhythms, singing styles with Anglo-American and other foreign elements pointed to a local hybridity which dissented or ruptured the dominance of Anglo-American music. Indeed, hybridity or kacukan in Malay formed the popular imaginations of the Malay-speaking peoples of the Malay Archipelago before nation-states came into being. Borderland research and cultural interactions inform us about how ordinary people understand modernity, social transformations, progress, nationhood, and identity. Performing modernity was constantly being negotiated and recreated. The travelling performers in the Malay Archipelago imagined their own versions of modernity through sonic hybridity as they interacted with the diverse peoples in the region. Themes in the recorded songs of this era were in line with contemporary debates found in the novels, newspaper articles, and other writings about the need for Malays to progress and to work towards independence. The singers sang about how to create a better and more advanced society with moral responsibilities. These songs often had catchy melodies superimposed on the waltz, foxtrot, tango, and rumba rhythms. For instance, Ahmad Sibi sang about the love of the country and different races living together in Malaya, and Malaya Raya, or the Great Malaya. Zubir Said recorded patriotic songs for Singapore. Topical songs mixed with humor and local dialects that exposed the problems of the ordinary people also emerged. These songs use Pasar Malay or Market Malay, a type of colloquial Malay with words from other languages used by the working class, multi-ethnic population. Many recordings of comic songs also describe the hardships faced by the ordinary Malay nerve oil merchant, the Chinese trishaw puller, the Malay medicine man, and the Indian murtabak seller. The small businessmen were inevitably harassed by the police. Humor eases anxieties about modernity and change.
Angkel murtabak tersalah cakap, mata gelap datang tangkap, kena masuk dalam lokap, sentral polisi 3 tingkap. Dalam lokap 50 hari, Uncle kena gigit jari. Dapat bekal beri-beri, hampir masuk bidadari.
The performers themselves occupied a borderland space where traditional gender identities were renegotiated and reshaped to enable Muslim women and men to perform together as well as with other ethnic groups. It was a transformational space in which women performers challenged mainstream gender identities within the patriarchal system. While the daily activities of ordinary village women of the colonial period were associated with the home and village community, the women performers had careers and became stars and earned wages as professional performers. Women performers led alternative lifestyles. They were recording artists, they had full-time jobs and earned an income. They were stars who sang in public and were featured by the mass media. They were glamorous and had fans who admired them. Special titles such as Miss Orchid were given to them. Miss Julia was also known as the Sophie Tucker of Malaya because of her strong voice and body. Mena Yem was known as the Queen of Dance as she could perform the latest tango, rumba and foxtrot as well as Malay social dances. The women performers were entrepreneurial. Maria Menado was a beauty queen and she set fashion trends in the 1950s. She was a film star, a recording artist, and the first woman to start her own film company called Maria Menado Film Productions. However, the women performers were criticized by the conservative Muslims as women of low morals, who performed on stage at night and were gazed at by men. They negotiated the discourses that tried to contain them by engaging with conventions of Malay Muslim female respectability and cultural decorum. They danced with men on stage without touching them, as this was the custom in Malay folk dance, instead of the European dresses that were worn by non-Malay cabaret girls of the period. The Malay women singers were always featured on stage and in advertisements wearing Malay costumes, such as the sarong kebaya and sometimes the Malay veil or selendang. The women performers' lives suggest that while they were able to negotiate the contradictions in patriarchal society as singers, actresses, and entrepreneurs who earn money professionally, they continued to be constrained by mainstream conservative Muslim society. They still shouldered the main responsibilities in the household during the day when they were not performing. What was important was that they had the ability to remap the borders of modernity themselves, take action to cross these borders, and make sense of their borderland localities and identities. In conclusion, research on cultural borderlands has generally been underrepresented in official history records and in music studies, as it challenges the notions of fixed cultural boundaries and the authenticity of traditions as defined by the colonial and nation states. I have shown that borderland research provides new insights, particularly into decolonizing sonic historiography of maritime Southeast Asia. Cultural borderland studies also highlight the agency of the musicians and singers who made strategic choices in negotiating the forces of colonization and modernization. Musicians and singers of the Malay Archipelago appropriated popular music, the forms and instruments, and new media technology from Europe and America. But they deconstructed and indigenized Anglo-American music through cultural mixing, hybridity, and song texts about social change. They added musical elements from the Nusantara, China, Middle East, and India, and practiced a kind of strategic sonic hybridity. By so doing, they challenged British attempts to create the Anglophone Malayan. The musicians and singers advocated their own sense of being modern in a changing society through currency, adaptability, combinations of folk and new elements, texts concerning a more advanced society and their social concerns. Malay theatre practitioners and musicians of different backgrounds were also defining a form of inclusive Malayness through their trans-border practices, networks, mobility across the region, interactions, and marriages with different people. This definition differed from the mainstream nationalists who essentialized the Malay race. Muslim women performers became professional stars and developed strategies to counter the criticisms of Muslim conservatives. The study of cultural borderlands and sonic mobility changes our sense of geography that need not correspond to the borders of nation states. Borders were fluid across Asia in the colonial era. In contrast to the nation-state narratives, the popular imagination of ordinary people in the Malay Archipelago was hybrid. This type of study counters the Malaysian state's invention of Malay traditions and its attempts to Malayize hybrid genres for nationalistic purposes. Unlike today, claims over the melodies and songs did not exist prior to the formation of nation-states. Borrowing tunes and changing lyrics were common in the Malay world, as the Malay song was the pan-Malay music and belonged to the people of the Malay Archipelago. Thank you. 谢谢. Terima kasih.
Thank you, Dr. Tan. I think that was a perfect way to open our session for today, where we're focusing on the topic of boundaries. I remind everyone that if you have a question, please type them in the Q&A box in the Zoom. You can find it in the bottom of your screens, or perhaps you can raise your virtual hand, and I will ask our secretariat to tell me if they see anybody raising their hands. Perhaps I can begin while people are still typing their questions. Dr. Tan, your outline of the sonic history of the bangsawan has shown that it has expanded to almost all the countries in Southeast Asia and to many other cities in the Pacific, except the Philippines. How would you account for this when most of the cities also were areas where Filipino musicians were also active? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Leon, Laverne. Yeah, I suspect that the performers also went as far as southern Philippines, of the in the south. Yeah, but I don't think that they went as far as Manila, because I think it's a quite different background of people, right, in the north and in the south. So I think, from the records that I've gone through, the performers tell me that they went as far as Borneo, yeah, but they never talk about the Sulu Sea or whether they crossed the Sulu Seas or not. So, but I suspect that they also perform there. If the people there are speaking a type of Malay language, because the main language that was used was Malay, they would mix with other languages, of course, but if the people do not speak the language, then they will probably not go as far as southern Philippines. Yeah, so this is like what I think lah. Yeah, but at the same time, I think Filipino musicians played a very big role in the formation of music in bangsawan. People like Alfonso Soriano and others, yeah, because their parents already came here earlier to set up the British bands, to help the British set up colonial bands. Yeah? So when the contracts ended, they just stayed back and performed with the bangsawan and traveled with the bangsawan, and then they married locals and just stayed on here. Yeah, so the Filipinos, played a very big role. And also I think that it's not only the musicians, but I was also told that dancers, from Manila also came by and helped to set up dance troupes. Yeah, especially, during the vaudeville sessions. So usually during the show, they will have vaudeville sections where there's dancing, singing, from all parts of the world. And the Filipino musicians and dancers played a big role in these vaudeville sections. Yeah.
Thank you. Perhaps there are things we don't know yet also about the things that are going on. Maybe our Philippine theater experts in the panel later will be able to discover some engagements of Malay musicians and Filipino performers. Very distinctly, for example, that Uncle, what was the title again? Uncle Mortabak, Uncle, the number that one of the music, one of the songs that you featured.
Terambulan?
No, the second one, the Uncle.
Adonda Sayang.
I think it was the third, the one that talks about the police running after the. But it sounds very much like the kind of music here also in the 30s and 40s. Mambo Magsaysay, I remember.
Correct.
Yeah. It sounds very much like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, I see a hand raised from the participants. Dr. Ramon Santos, are you able to turn on your microphone? You are on mute. Can the secretariat please? There, Dr. Santos?
Oh, okay. Was there any base or was there any form on which the bangsawan was based upon, or it just happened? I mean, it just gathered all these different styles and formed the bangsawan. Do you understand what I mean?
Yes, of course. Yeah. So the bangsawan actually was influenced by the Parsi theater from Bombay. So the Parsi theater, the stories, they use a lot of Shakespeare stories and a mixture of stories. And so this Parsi theater was traveling all over Southeast Asia, and the Jawi Peranakan, which is the people who were mixed Muslim Indian people in Penang, started their own troupe based on the Parsi theater, which they called Tiruan Wayang Parsi. That means a copy of the Parsi theater. But they started using Malay, and then they introduced their own local characteristics, and they started touring. So wherever they went, so if there are more Chinese, then they would play Chinese stories, and they would borrow performers from the Chinese opera to play together with them. Yeah. So if they go to an Indian place, they would also do the same. So it has always been a very flexible form, and it always incorporated new music that came out, new instruments that came out, and so on. But it started as an imitation of Wayang Parsi from Bombay.
Okay, does the Farsi theater still exist?
Sorry?
Does the Farsi theater still exist?
I think the opera types, these are all opera types because they use a lot of singing. Instead of talking, they would sing their conversations and so on. So they were very popular during the colonial era, early 20th century. But with the introduction of film and modern theater, modern opera, and the audiences also began to change, the states also began to change. So, there are very few of these troupes left.
I see.
performing. So even in Malaysia, the bangsawan is not performed unless the state or some university puts it up, because it requires a lot of money, and also it requires a lot of people to be involved, because you have to do build the stage, and then you have to do painting, and many people, costumes, and so on. So it's almost dying here, I must say, and it's very sad. But then the times have already changed, you see. So we can't keep a form that was very popular in the 20th century and was performed for mass audiences who had no exposure to film and so on. But today our audiences are very different, so we cannot keep the same form and perform it again the same way today.
It's too bad. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank
Also,
you, Dr.
maybe
Tan.
I want to just add a bit about why I decided to do this type of study. I think like when I was beginning to do research in ethnomusicology, many ethnomusicologists would focus on the chord forms or forms that are so-called more traditional. Yeah, but in my case, when I started to do research, there was this national policy in Malaysia, and because of the national policy, the ethno-nationalists tried to Malayize the sort of traditional forms. So for me, when I looked at the form on the ground, it's so different from what the state is trying to promote. So this type of study, like when I went back to interview people, to perform with the performers themselves and lived with them and traveled with them, I just found that the popular imagination of the performers is very different from what the state is trying to create. So this sort of study is very important, I think, to counter the state's, the nation state's agenda, to Malayize forms because they want to make national culture Malay. Yeah. So, but for me, if I study this, I also show that, the Malays were very hybrid when they were, in their popular imagination, and they were very inclusive of all types of cultures. So this is the way to go for me. Yeah, if we want to create a national culture in Malaysia or in Indonesia or any other country. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A box. Ms. Rachel Ong, would you like to deliver the question yourself if you are able to turn on your microphone? Otherwise, I can read. Rachel? There she is. Could you unmute yourself?
Hi. Could you just read the question?
Okay. And so let me read it for Rachel. Thanks for this wonderful presentations. I have two questions. One, could you share with us the developments of bangsawan and if they are still performed today? Two, it seems that the only version of Terang Bulan we can hear today in Malaysia is the national anthem Negaraku. Could you also share with us why?
Yeah, I think, Rachel, your question is connected to what I just tried to explain earlier. I think that the nation state of Malaysia, so-called, they had this policy, the national culture policy, which stated that the national culture of Malaysia, should be based on the culture of the indigenous people, so-called Malays. But when you look at these traditional forms, even wayang kulit and mak yong and all that, they're all very, very hybrid, right? So in bangsawan, what the state tried to do was to get rid of all the Western elements, get rid of the Chinese or Indian elements, and just focused on stories about, you know, the kingdom, the Malay kingdom from the past, yeah, and focus on the court performers, you know, actors and actresses were performing about kings and queens, whereas in the past, I think it was very different. So I think that this is also connected to why the version of Terang Bulan that we hear today is the national anthem. Yeah, because if it is the national anthem, it has to be more Malay than, you know, what it was in the past lah. Yeah, so I think there's a denial by the nation state, yeah, that the Malays were very, very hybrid in the past. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. We have another question here from Jocelyn Guadalupe. Joy, are you able to turn on your microphone and ask the question yourself? Dr. Guadalupe.
Well, I can answer this question. It is not included in the school curriculum. I think in the school curriculum, they just play gamelan, they play kompang, and then they also do a bit of, you know, the gong chime music. Yeah. But bangsawan is, I think, very, very difficult to stage. And only, as I said earlier, universities who have the expertise and also the money, yeah, and also the nation state when they want to do national shows, perform bangsawan today. Otherwise, it is not performed anymore. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Tan. But this is the question. I'll read it for Jocelyn Guadalupe. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. While women performers strategize their actions through manner of dress and behavior, are there metaphors of resistance in the words of the songs or symbolic movements or dances that represents artistic blurring of their expected gender roles? That's the question from Dr. Guadalupe. There's a version of it also in the question and answer when you want to look at it, Dr. Tan. The strategic navigations of women performers aside from just dress.
No, I think for the performers, they were also singing about modernity in many of the songs, yeah. So which I didn't have time to go into. So they would talk about, you know, in their songs, especially in the text, they would talk about being good mothers, or being moral responsibilities of men and women as well. So you know, they sang about the moral responsibility to help the orphans, you know, to let women go out and work, yeah. And I think forced marriages is a very important issue during the day. So they sang a lot about that, yeah, that they don't want to marry old men or men that their parents introduced to them, you know, they want to choose their own husbands and so on. So I think in the musical text, they alluded to being modern and being able to remap the borders within the constraints of the patriarchal system. Yeah. So it's very, very interesting to look at some of the old gramophone records, yeah. Although it's very difficult to hear what they are singing, but we can make out the content quite a bit, yeah.
Thank you. We have related to the question I asked earlier, a comment from Rick Tremilios. Rick, are you able to turn on your microphone? Can the secretariat please turn on the microphone of Dr. Tremilios? There he is.
Hi. Yeah, actually, it wasn't a question as much as it was just a point of information that the bangsawan was known in Sulu, but only because Sulu people traveled to Jesselton, what used to be called Jesselton and Tawau in Borneo, and they did see bangsawan there. And there was a Tausug performer, his name was Albani, who saw it and came back to Sulu and invented a tradition which he called daling daling, which a lot of Filipinos know about. And so the song Sua Ko Sua comes from the daling daling tradition. And so it was sort of a kind of a copy, an adaptation of a Tausug adaptation of bangsawan. So what I said was it's kind of a third space. I mean, a double hybridity, which I thought was interesting.
Okay. Thanks so much, Rick, for this information.
He was popular in the 40s and 50s and into the 60s, but then in the 60s he moved actually to Tawau, and so he lived the rest of the time in Borneo, or what is now Malaysia.
Thank you, Rick. I think we have one more time for one more question. This is from Hans Gabriel de la Cruz. Thank you for sharing this to us. I just want to ask if the very act of hybridizing or parsing and piecing out different musical informations did change, or is it still the same as how people do it back then?
You mean today?
Yes.
No, I think it's very different because back in those days, we didn't have any exposure to television or the mass media or computer. So it's the performers base their hybrid creations on what they hear on the radio or what they see on stage. Yeah, so it's a lot of it is based on the imagination of what popular and what the modern is. But I think today it's we are exposed to music of the world, the whole world, through the internet and through the media, through the mass media. So we can access, different types of forms from Africa or Latin America, and we can just incorporate into our music. So I think that's what our local musicians are doing. But having said that, I think to show their identity, they also incorporate local instruments as well as local texts, and they use Malay, Chinese, or Tamil, in their compositions, and they use a lot of rap and hip hop and so on. So the latest trends in popular music are incorporated into the music, today.